The chapel at Hartsedge Hall had been swept and dressed by 6 that morning, and by 10 the June light came through the east window in long, warm bars across the stone, and Eveline Penistone stood at the foot of the aisle in a borrowed gown the color of cream, and did not move. The whole county had folded itself into the little box pews. The flowers were white. The curate had his book open at the proper place. At the rail, in a coat of bottle green that fit him too well to have been made in any country town, the bridegroom waited with his profile turned to the light, and he was handsome, and he was smiling, and he was not what he said he was. She did not yet know that. She knew only that her hands inside the worn kid gloves were cold, and that her aunt's hand at her shoulder was not gentle, and that somewhere behind her, against the wall where the servants stood, a tall footman in plain dark livery had gone very still. The curate drew his breath to begin. He spoke the old words about the estate of matrimony, that it was not to be entered into lightly, and he came at last to the question every soul in that chapel had heard 100 times, and never once seen answered, the question that asks if any man present knows just cause or impediment, why these two should not be joined. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the flowers stirring in the draught from the door. Then the footman spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not step from the wall. He said one word, low and level and entirely steady, the way a man says a thing he has already decided to lose his place for, and the word crossed the sunlit chapel and landed at the rail like a stone dropped into a still pond. Sturrock. The bridegroom's smile did not fall so much as freeze, caught halfway, a thing of wax in the warm light, and Eveline felt her aunt's fingers tighten to the bone. And the curate looked up from his book, with the question still half in his mouth. And every head in the chapel turned toward the plain, dark figure against the wall who had no business speaking at all. I want you to hold that chapel in your mind, the white flowers and the frozen smile, and the one word still ringing in the stone. Because the road that brought a footman to break a silence he had every reason to keep had run the whole length of a spring. And a great deal of it turned on a woman the house had agreed was already as good as sold. Let me take you back to the morning she first arrived, before the banns, before the gown, before she had ever heard the name a servant would one day speak aloud. Eveline Penistone came to Hartsedge in the 2nd week of March, in a hired chaise with 1 trunk and a writing box and 4 pounds in her reticule, and the house had decided what she was before the wheels had stopped on the gravel. She was the niece. She was the orphan daughter of a younger son who had died, owing money to half the trades in Mortlake, leaving a girl with a good education, a steady hand, and no portion at all, which in that part of the country was a kind of disgrace that everyone forgave aloud, and no one forgave in fact. She had come because there was nowhere else to come. Her father's brother had married money and died of gout, and his widow, Lady Cleona Dunmere, kept Hartsedge now and kept it well, and had written that the girl might have a home so long as the girl understood what a home given out of charity was worth. She was 25 years old. She had a quiet, upright carriage, and dark hair she pinned herself, and gray eyes that took in more than they gave back. And the one thing the house did not trouble to learn about her was that her father, before the drink and the debts, had been a man of figures and law copying, and had taught his daughter to read a deed and a settlement and a marriage license, the way other girls were taught to read a hymn. She could find the flaw in a document the way a tongue finds the broken tooth. She did not yet imagine that this small, unfashionable skill would matter to anyone alive. Lady Cleona received her in the yellow drawing-room, seated very straight in grey silk, with a single jet brooch at her throat, and she looked Eveline over the way a buyer looks over a horse at a country fair, and she was not cruel, and that was the worst of it, she was certain. She had been raised inside a world that priced women by their connections and their portions, and she had buried 2 husbands and a fortune of her own pride inside that world, and she believed in it as a curate believes in his book. The girl has nothing, she said to the companion who sat by the window, in a voice pitched to be heard. The girl has nothing, but she has a face, and a face will do, if it is managed. We shall see her settled by midsummer. Eveline poured the tea, and said nothing, and felt the words settle over her like the first thin dust on a shut-up room. She had been at Hardsedge 11 minutes, and the house had already decided she was a thing to be settled, and that was the first time the verdict was spoken in her hearing. It would not be the last. The man who would settle her arrived 3 weeks later, and the whole house woke up to him. He came under the name of the Viscount Loxby, and he came with a traveling carriage and a valet and a tailor's polish on every inch of him, and he came with a story so smooth it asked no questions of itself. He was lately returned from abroad, he said. His estate in the north was let, while certain matters of the family were arranged. He had heard of Lady Dunmere's hospitality and of her niece, and he had come to pay his respects, and he paid them so beautifully that within a se'night Lady Cleona spoke of him as though he were already her own. He was charming to the servants and generous with the stable. He praised the dinner and the garden and the late Lord Dunmere's claret. He was, in every visible particular, exactly what an impoverished girl's guardian prays for and never gets. Eveline distrusted him from the second day, and she could not have told anyone why. And so she said nothing, because a portionless niece who distrusts a viscount is a girl who will be told she is ungrateful. She watched him instead. She saw how his eyes went to the silver and the pictures before they went to her face. She saw that his stories of the north never named a town twice, and that when Lady Cleona pressed him gently about his people, he turned the question into a compliment so deftly that the question simply ceased to exist. She saw that he was a man performing a part he had played many times before, and she had no proof of anything, and proof was the only currency the house would take. That she was as good as sold was the second voicing of the verdict. And it came in the open this time. It came at a card party in the long parlor, where the county had gathered to look at the Viscount and approve him. A neighbor, Mrs. D. Galt, a comfortable widow, with a loud, kind heart and no discretion whatever, set it across the whist table, while Eveline stood within 3 feet of her holding the candle snuffers. The Penistone girl has fallen on her feet, Mrs. Mende. Galt said, well pleased for her, a penniless niece, and a viscount for the asking. She is as good as sold, and to a coronet, which is more than most of us managed. The table laughed. Its comfortable laugh, and Eveline trimmed the candle and did not let her hand shake, and understood that the whole county had already written the end of her story and found it a happy one. She did not know his Christian name then, below stairs. He was only Wren, taken on at Candlemas, a tall, quiet man of perhaps 33, with a still face and a sailor's economy of movement, and the other servants found him cold. He did his work without complaint and kept his own counsel, and spoke when he was spoken to, and the housekeeper called it pride, and the kitchen called it dullness, and Eveline, who had been raised to read a room before she read a book, found it neither. She found it watchfulness. He watched the Viscount the way a man on a deck watches a sky that is not yet broken, but means to. She first spoke to him over a dropped fan. It was an evening in April, on the cold stair by the garden door, and she had let her aunt's borrowed fan slip from her fingers, and he had it before it touched the stone, with a quickness that did not belong to a man whose whole trade was to be slow and invisible. He returned it to her, and as he did, his eyes went past her shoulder to the parlor door, where the Viscount's laugh was rising, and then came back to her face, and held there 1/2 second too long, and she understood that he had something to say, and had decided again not to say it. He said only that the stair was cold, and she should mind her footing in the dark. His voice was low and even, and carried the flattened vowels of a man who had been somewhere salt. And far he went on, with the tray. She watched him after that. She saw how he stood against the wall at dinner, with his eyes never quite on the Viscount, and never quite off him. She saw him in the front hall one wet morning examining, with the small bored care of a man dusting, the great traveling trunk the valet had left for the carrier, reading the painted initials on its end. She saw him pause, once on the gravel below the morning-room window where the Viscount stood dictating a letter to his valet, and she saw the footman's whole body change, the way a still animal changes when a sound it has been waiting a long while for finally comes. She did not know what he had heard. She knew only that he had been waiting to hear it. What she did not yet know was that the man called Wren had a name above stairs, as well as below, and that he had come to Heart's Edge not to carry trays but to find a single man, and that he had very nearly given the search up for dead. His name was Marcus Wren, and he had been a lieutenant in the Navy until a wound and the peace had put him on half pay, and then on no pay at all. And he was the son of an apothecary in Mortlake, a careful gentleman who had taught his boy chemistry and Latin and the keeping of honest books before the boy ran off to sea. None of that was the part that mattered. The part that mattered was his sister. Evelyn learned it slowly, over a fortnight of stolen half-minutes in the language of work, because there is no other language. 2 servants in a watched house are permitted. He would carry coals to a grate she happened to be tending, and they would speak in low, quick sentences over the fire-irons. She would find a pretext to want the silver counted, and he would count it and talk. And what she drew out of him, thread by careful thread, was a story that turned the smooth, bright Viscount in the drawing-room into something cold all the way down. Marcus had a younger sister, Rosa, and 3 years past in a watering town on the coast. A charming gentleman calling himself by a borrowed title had courted her, married her in a quiet ceremony, with a special license and a complacent curate, taken the small inheritance their father had left her, and vanished inside of a season. He had left her a wife, in name, and a ruin in fact. With a marriage no one in the world but a missing man could confirm, and a child coming, and a parish that looked at her the way parishes look. Rosa had not survived the winter that followed. The child had not survived the birth. And Marcus, who had been at sea when the courting began and limping home on a wound when it ended, had come back to find a grave and a packet of letters in a strange man's hand and a single thing to do with the rest of his life, which was to find the man and prove what he was. He had been hunting for 2 years. He had followed the false name through 3 counties and lost it twice. He had taken service at Heart's Edge because a man in livery is furniture that walks, and furniture can stand in a room while its betters talk and never be remembered. And because the new Viscount courting the Dunmere niece had a laugh, he half knew, and a story with the same shape as the story that had killed his sister. He had not been certain. End quote. He needed to be certain before he spoke, because a footman who accuses a Viscount and is wrong is a footman transported, and a footman who accuses a Viscount and is right had still better have his proof in his hand. Eveline should have been frightened of him. A strange man under a false name in her aunt's house, with a private grief and a private purpose, telling her a tale no magistrate would hear from a servant. She found instead that she believed him to the marrow, and the believing was worse than fear, because it meant she was standing now inside the thing, and the wage of a charity niece does not stretch to cover that. To the kitchen he was still only the cold, quiet footman who kept to himself. The label had not shifted below stairs, even as the man behind it walked into the center of her days. That was the second verdict she had watched the house hand down and seen prove false, the first being its verdict on herself, and she began to mistrust every judgment Heart's Edge had ever made. The comfortable, certain, well-meaning judgments that priced a man by his coat and a woman by her portion, and were wrong, she now saw as often as they were right. The courtship moved with a speed that frightened her. The Viscount had a reason for haste, and his reason wore Lady Cleona's face, because Lady Cleona wanted the thing done before the season pulled her county neighbors away to town and took with them the audience for so fine a match. The banns were called. Eveline sat in the family pew on 3 successive Sundays, and heard her own name, and the false one read out together into the quiet church, and felt each time as though a door were being walled up brick by brick with herself inside. She tried, once, to speak to her aunt. She said carefully that she knew so little of the Viscount's family, that she wished only to be sure. Lady Cleona set down her cup and looked at her with a patience that was its own kind of wall. "You have nothing, Eveline," she said, not unkindly. "A woman who has nothing does not get to be sure. She gets to be grateful. I was not sure of either of my husbands. Sureness is a luxury of the rich." She picked her cup up again. "We will not speak of it so foolishly a second time." That night, Eveline could not sleep, and she went down by the back stair for water, and found the footman in the dim front hall. And he was not idle. He stood at the long side table with the household letter tray before him, and in his hand was a sheet. He had no right to hold the letter. The Viscount had given the manservant to Frank for the Morning Post. He was not stealing it. He was reading the direction and the seal with a fixed, careful patience, copying something onto a scrap with a stub of pencil, and when he heard her bare foot on the boards, he did not start or hide it. He looked up and let her see what he was about. "It is going to a Mr. Sturrock," he said very quietly, "in a house in Sarn. He sends a letter there every fortnight, always the same hand on the outside, never franked in his own name." He told me Sturrock, as one tells a stranger a fact and watches what the fact does to her face. "Eveline, that is the name I have been chasing for 2 years. It is his own." She came and stood beside him in the cold hall, and he showed her the scrap, and she, who could parse a deed better than anyone in that house, read the small, careful copy he had made of the superscription, and she felt the floor of Hartsedge tilt the way it had tilted the day she understood she had been sold. "The man who is to marry me," she said slowly, "sends a secret letter every fortnight in his true name to a stranger in Sarn." "Not a stranger," Marcus said. His voice did not change, and that steadiness was the most terrible thing about it. "The house in Sarn is where I traced the last of the money my sister left. There is a woman there. I have not been able to learn her name." He folded the scrap small and put it away. "A man who writes faithfully every fortnight to a house he keeps secret is keeping something in it. I mean to learn what?" They became, across that strange, bright spring, 2 servants conspiring in plain sight in a house full of servants. It was a courtship, though neither of them would have dared the word, and it was conducted entirely in the grammar of duty. He carried a hod to a room she dusted, and they spoke under cover of the work. She copied a date from the license that lay one careless afternoon on Lady Cleona's writing desk, and slipped the copy into his glove with the cleared plates. He gave her instructions in the short, flat way of a man who had commanded a gun deck, and she heard them at first as coldness and learned to hear them as what they were, which was a man trying to keep a woman alive in a current he understood and she did not. Go nowhere alone with him. Be seen to know nothing. Keep your hands steady when they speak of you as if you were a clock on the mantel. Eat. You are thinner than you were a month ago, and you will need your strength before this is done. And she learned the shape of his grief, which was the thing she had read in him, and not understood. It was not coldness. It was a man who had spent 2 years being a thing that could not be heard. A servant, a half-pay nobody, a brother with a true tale and no standing to tell it, and who had stopped expecting to be heard at all, and who carried in a flat tin box in his livery pocket a packet of his dead sister's letters, in the false hand of the man now smiling at the head of Lady Dunmere's table. He showed Eveline the letters once, by a single candle in the still room, and she read 3 of them, and she gave them back without a word, because there were no words, and because she saw that what he wanted was not comfort but a witness, and that a witness was a thing she could be. Here I will say one small thing to you, before the spring turns and the matter goes hard, and then I will say nothing of the kind again. Hold the picture of those 2 by the one candle. The man with his sister's letters, and the woman who had nothing but the wit to read them. The world had a verdict on each of them, and the verdict was wrong on each, and the whole of what follows is only the long, slow work of the world being made to see it. Now to the turn which came, as such turns do, dressed as a victory. The Viscount, who was not a stupid man and not a careless one, had begun to feel a draught. A man who has lived as long as he had by reading rooms learns to feel the one pair of eyes in a room that has measured him. He felt the footman. He could not have said why. He only knew that the tall, quiet servant, taken on a Candlemas, stood too still, and watched too well. And so the Viscount did the thing a competent fraud does, which was to move against the watcher before the watcher could move against him. It began with small things. The footman was set to the heaviest, farthest work, the cellars, the stables, the long carriage drives to the coast, kept always out of the house and away from the rooms where the family spoke. Then a thing went missing, a silver-gilt snuff-box from the Viscount's own dressing table, and was found by the Viscount's own valet, rolled in a stocking in the footman's box, under the eaves. Marcus had not taken it. Eveline knew he had not taken it as surely as she knew her own name. It did not matter. A footman, accused of theft by a Viscount's man, is a footman the law will take, and the only reason Marcus was not given to the constable that same hour was that Lady Cleona did not want a scandal in the house in the very week the wedding clothes were being fitted. He was to be turned off without a character the morning after the wedding, and held below stairs and watched until then, and warned, through the steward, that if he spoke a word against the family or its guest, he would find the snuff-box was only the first charge against him. This is the part that comfortable verdict never reckons with, and I want it understood. The Viscount did not blunder. He saw the danger and he met it. He did not leave the one paper that could ruin him lying in an unlocked box. The letters to Sarn he now carried, franked in his own coat, and burned the answers. The license he kept on his person. He set a watch on the footman and a frame around him and a charge over his head, and he did it coolly and well, and a lesser story would have ended there, with the witness silenced and the wedding bright and the county pleased. It did not end there, and the reason it did not end there had nothing to do with luck. The reason was that Eveline Penistone had been taught to read a document, and that she now had 4 days, and that no one in the house thought her worth watching. She had seen in the false victory of the frame the one careless edge the Viscount had left. He had grown sure. A man who has tied up his enemy stops looking over the enemy's shoulder. In tying up Marcus, he had taken his own eyes off the bride, because the bride was a portionless creature who had been sold and would be grateful. And that verdict, the house's oldest and most comfortable verdict, was the very thing she would use. She went to Mrs. Coster. Mrs. Coster was the housekeeper, 56, broad and grey and shrewd, with a ring of keys at her waist, and no love at all for the smooth Viscount who had got an honest under-footman framed for a theft she did not for one moment believe. Eveline had been kind to Mrs. Coster in 100 small uncounted ways across the spring, had carried up a tray when the housekeeper's knees were bad, had read her the letters from her son at sea, had asked after the boy by name. None of it had been done for a purpose, and all of it now came back. Mrs. Coster asked quietly, and told the truth plainly, did the bravest thing a servant in such a house can do. She believed the niece over the guest. She had a brother who drove the Sarn coach, and 4 days before the wedding, while the house was a storm of ribbon and silver, and the Viscount thought every loose thread cut a covered cart, went quietly to Sarn and quietly came back, and what it brought back changed everything. It brought back Rosa Tranter, not the dead sister, the other woman. The woman in the house in Sarn to whom the secret letters went every fortnight, and whose name Marcus had never been able to learn, and who turned out to be no mistress and no creditor but a wife, a living, lawful wife, married to one Julius Storrock 4 years past in a parish church under his own true name, with the lines in the register and a copy in her box. And the rector still living who had read them. She had thought herself a widow these 3 years. The fortnightly letters were not love. They were money, a little money, and a great many lies, sent to keep a discarded wife quiet and far and incurious in a town where no one of his world would ever go. He had not divorced her because a man cannot divorce a wife in that age without an act of Parliament and a fortune and a scandal that would have ended him. He had simply left her alive, and paid and forgotten in Sarn, and gone out into the world to marry money under a borrowed coronet, again and again as he had married Rosa Wren, as he meant now to marry Eveline Penistone. She came to Hartsedge in the covered cart in the grey of the morning, a thin, worn woman with a steady country dignity, and Mrs. Coster hid her in the still room, and Eveline went down to her, and the 2 women sat by the cold hearth and put the whole of it together, the dates, the names, the 2 churches, the dead girl and the living wife, until the shape of the man stood between them, clear and entire and damning. Rosa Tranter had brought her marriage lines in an oiled cloth. Eveline read them by the early light with the eye her father had given her. The seal, the hand, the names, the date that fell a full year before the Viscount had ever set his polished boot in their county, and she knew with the certainty the house had told her she had no right to, that this paper would not bend. Now there was proof. Now there was a living wife, and a parish register, and a date no smile could talk away. And now there was a question, and it was Eveline's to answer, because Marcus was locked below with a theft over his head, and could do nothing. And the answer she chose is the whole of why this is her story, and not only his. She could have fled. She had the proof. She could have walked out of Heartsedge in the dark with Rosa Tranter, and gone to the magistrate, Sir Aldous Brixton, 4 miles off, and laid it before him, and saved herself by simple flight. It would have been the safe thing, and the clever thing. She did not do it. She had watched this man court a county into clapping for him. She had watched him frame an honest man and stop a true mouth, and very nearly walk clean out of a second marriage over the body of the first. She had learned, this spring, exactly how the world's comfortable verdict could be turned into a weapon, and she chose to turn it into one. She would let the verdict run. She would let the house believe to the very last that the girl with nothing was being gratefully sold. She would stand up in the white gown before the whole assembled county that had laughed and clapped and priced her, and she would let the man think he had won, all the way to the rail, all the way to the question, and then she would have the truth spoken, in the one place and the one moment it could never afterward be buried. She got word to Marcus through Mrs. Coster. 3 lines, no more. She told him what had come from Sarn. She told him the wife was safe in the house, and the lines were sound. And she told him to be in the chapel. Getting him there was its own small war. Fought below stairs in the last 2 days, and Mrs. Coster fought it. The steward had orders to keep the footman from the wedding. Coster, who held the keys and knew which doors were watched and which forgotten, saw to it that on the wedding morning the disgraced footman, in his plain dark livery, was wanted to carry the heavy plate into the chapel anteroom, under her own eye, where no one looked twice at a servant doing a servant's lifting, and where the door to the chapel itself stood open to the warm June light. The Viscount, dressing in bottle green, thought his watcher safely shut in a cellar. He was wrong, and he had made the oldest of his errors, which was to forget that the people he had used as furniture could choose to be witnesses. The morning of the wedding, the sun came up clear and hot, and Heartsedge filled with the county. The bells rang, the chapel filled. Lady Cleona, in grey silk and triumph, walked her niece to the foot of the aisle with a grip like a closing trap, and the girl with nothing went up the warm stone in the borrowed cream gown, with her face still and her hands cold and her heart going like a drum, carrying inside her a thing the whole bright chapel could not see. And the curate, Mr. Pellow, drew his breath and read the old words, and came to the question. He asked if any man present knew just cause or impediment. And against the wall, where the heavy plate had been set down, and a footman in dark livery stood among the other servants. With his still face and his sailor's stillness, Marcus Wren said one word, Sturrock. It went into the warm stone, and the white flowers, and the held breath of 200 people. Like a coin dropped onto marble, the bridegroom's smile froze on his face. The curate's question died unfinished in his mouth. Lady Cleona's grip on her niece's shoulder went rigid as iron, and every head in the chapel turned toward the plain dark servant who had broken the one silence a wedding offers, and then forever closes. The bridegroom recovered first. He was good. He had been good for years. He turned at the rail with an air of injured astonishment so well made that half the chapel believed it before he had said 3 words, and he asked, lightly, coldly, what a dismissed footman, a proven thief, meant by speaking in a house of God, and he looked to Lady Cleona, and Lady Cleona rose in her wrath to have the man thrown out. And for one breath, the old certainty gathered itself to crush the truth as it always had. That was the breath Eveline had been waiting for the whole of the spring. She stepped out of her aunt's grip and into the center of the aisle, in the cream gown, in the warm bars of light. and she did not raise her voice because she had learned from a sailor that the steady word carries further than the loud one. She said that the man at the rail was named Julius Sturrock, and that he had a living wife, married under his own name 4 years past, and that the wife was in this house. She said it plainly, the way her father had taught her to read a fact aloud from a paper, without heat, without plea, and the plainness of it was worse for the bridegroom than any scream could have been. He did what a competent fraud does. He fought. He called it a slander, a servant's plot, a penniless girl's hysteria got up by a thief to extort the family. He turned to the county with his beautiful injured face, and he was for a moment winning, because the county wanted to be told it had not been fooled, and a frightened curate and a furious dowager and 200 neighbors were all reaching for the comfortable thing. Then Mrs. Coster opened the anteroom door, and Rosa Tranter walked into the chapel. She came up the side aisle in her plain country gown, with her marriage lines in the oiled cloth in her 2 hands, and she walked straight to the rail and stopped before the man in bottle green, and looked at him, and she said in a voice that shook and did not break, that she knew him, that she was his wife, that she had thought herself his widow these 3 years, and that here was the register copy and the name of the rector who had married them and was living yet to swear it. She laid the oiled cloth open on the rail in the warm light, and the man's beautiful made face, for the first time in the whole bright spring, came apart, because there are some papers a smile cannot talk away, and his wife and his name and his own true hand on the register were 3 of them. Eveline picked up the lines and held them so the nearest neighbors could see, and she named the date that fell a year before he had come into the county, and she let the date do its work in the silence, and the silence did it. The county looked from the paper to the man, and the verdict turned over in the room like a tide. Sir Aldous Brixton, the magistrate who had been sitting in the 3rd pew in his Sunday coat with no notion he would be wanted, rose slowly to his feet, and that rising was the law coming awake, and the man at the rails saw it come awake and knew the spring was over. What I have not yet told you is the smallest thing in the chapel, and the one that mattered most to her, and it is this. In the held silence, after the lines lay open on the rail, while the magistrate rose and the dowager stood stricken, and the bridegroom's mask hung in pieces, the footman crossed the chapel. He came from the wall and up the warm stone aisle, past the flowers, to the place where Eveline stood with the marriage lines in her steady hands, and he stopped before her in his disgraced dark livery in front of the whole assembled county, and he said her name. Eveline. He had never used it before. Below stairs and above, in the still room and the cold hall across the whole careful spring, he had said Miss Penistone, or said nothing. And now in the one place where every soul she knew could hear it, he said only her given name, low and level and entirely without hope of reward. And it was the first time in her life a man had claimed her in front of the world instead of pricing her. That was all he said. He did not make a speech. He did not match the man's cruelty with cruelty of his own. He stood in his ruin with the truth standing up all around him, and he said her name. And to Eveline it was louder than the bells had been. Julius Sturrock did not go to the gallows because the law of that age was a slow and strange machine. And bigamy and fraud are not always hanging matters, and a man with no money left, and no name left, and a living wife and 2 parishes against him is a man the world destroys without troubling the rope. He was taken in charge by Sir Aldous Brixton that same hour. The borrowed coronet was stripped from him before the county that had bowed to it. He was given over to the courts, and the courts were slow and certain, and the end of him was not death but erasure. The thing he had done to 2 women turned at last upon himself. He was made a nothing, a fraud unmasked, a name struck out, and he went out of Hartsedge in a constable's cart by the same gravel he had come up so finely in the spring. And the county that had clapped him in did not come out to watch him go. Lady Cleona Dunmere was not destroyed either. And this is where the slow, just machine of that world showed its mercy, which was not softness, but correction. She had not known. She had been a fool and a hard one, and her folly had very nearly sold her own brother's child to a monster, and she had to live in the county that had watched it. She did not fragment into a villain. She fragmented into an old woman who had been certain her whole life, and had been, in the one thing that mattered most, comprehensively wrong. She sat in the emptying chapel after the cart had gone in her gray silk and her humbled triumph, and she looked at the niece she had priced and sold and very nearly buried alive, and the verdict of a lifetime came apart behind her eyes. She did not make a pretty speech of it. She said to Eveline, low and unsteady, only that she had been sure, and that she saw now what sureness was worth. It was not an apology a stage would have used. It was the true, small, broken thing. And Eveline, who did not gloat, and had never once in the whole spring asked to be proved right for the pleasure of it, took her aunt's hand, and said that it was over now, and meant it, and that mercy was its own kind of correction, and the harder one to give. Rosa Tranter did not go back to Sarn alone. Mrs. Stick, Coster's brother, drove her, but Marcus rode beside the cart the first miles, and what passed between the brother of one ruined woman and the survivor who was another I will leave to them, save to say that the man who had spent 2 years unable to be heard had at last been heard in a chapel full of the county, and that the hearing did not bring his sister back, and that he stood a long while at the gate after the cart had gone. And Eveline stood with him, and neither of them spoke, because some griefs are not mended, only witnessed, and a witness was the thing each of them had found in the other. There was no second wedding that summer, and the county thought there should have been, and was wrong again, because the two of them had had enough that year of haste and of being told what they were worth, by people who had not asked. They were married the following spring, quietly, in the same small chapel with the warm light coming through the east window in long bars across the stone, and Mrs. Coster stood up with the bride. And there was no coronet anywhere in it, and Marcus Wren stood at the rail in a plain good coat, as the man he was. An apothecary's son, a half-pay lieutenant, a man with no fortune and a true name, and the curate, Mr. Prex, Pello, who had nearly read the wrong words over the wrong man a year before, read the right ones now. And when he came to the question about just cause and impediment, the whole chapel held its breath out of memory and then let it go, because this time there was none, and the silence after the question was the good silence, the one a wedding is meant to have. If Eveline's journey moved you, I hope you will carry her with you a little while, and perhaps say so where others can find her. There are a great many quiet women being priced in drawing-rooms, and a great many of them have wit enough to read the paper, if only the world would let them. She kept one thing from that whole bright, terrible year, and it was not the register copy, and not the gown. On the morning of the false wedding in the chapel anteroom, while she waited with her cold hands and her hidden truth, a single white flower had fallen from the dressing of the arch and lain on the stone, and the footman, passing with the heavy plate, had stooped without a word and set it on the sill of the open window where the June light came through. She had seen him do it, and said nothing. She took the flower up after, pressed and dry, and kept it, and a year on it lay between the leaves of her father's old book of figures, the book that had taught her to read the lie in a paper, and so to read the truth of a man. And on quiet evenings in the small good house that was now her own, she would open the book to find a sum, and find the flower, instead brown and weightless and whole, and close the book again, and sit a while in the warm last light with her hand flat on the cover, and not need to open it at all to know that it was there.